Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion, How Protecting Wildlife Can Help Prevent Pandemics, brought to you by the St. Louis Zoo and the Living Earth Collaborative. I'm today's moderator, Jonathan Lossis, a professor in the biology department at Washington University. I'm also the director of the Living Earth Collaborative, which is a partnership between WashU, the St. Louis Zoo, and the Missouri Botanical Garden, focused on conducting research and conserving the world's biodiversity. Today's topic needs little introduction. Our lives and those of everyone in the world have been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic. What is not appreciated, however, is that this pandemic is a direct result of how humans interact with the world's biodiversity, and in fact was predicted by scientists for many years. To learn more about this topic, we're going to hear from three internationally renowned experts who are members of the St. Louis biodiversity community, Drs. Sharon Deem and Lisa Kelly from the St. Louis Zoo, and Dr. David Wang from the Washington University School of Medicine. One last note before we get going. The talk should take about 40 minutes, after which we will have a question and answer session for the remaining 20 minutes. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. With that, let's get going. Our first speaker today is Dr. Sharon Deem, director of the St. Louis Zoo's Institution for Conservation Medicine. Dr. Deem holds a doctorate in veterinary medicine, as well as a PhD in veterinary epidemiology. Before coming to the St. Louis Zoo, Dr. Deem worked as a veterinarian both in field sites around the world, ranging from the Galapagos to the Congo rainforest, as well as being a veterinarian at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. She literally wrote the book on the field of One Health, which is the topic of her talk today. Thanks for being with us here today, Dr. Deem.
Thank you, Dr. Lassos. I'm so excited about this panel. I'm very excited to be kicking us off. What I'd like to do with my few minutes is really talk about One Health. There are a few folks in the audience who may not have heard of this new approach, how we got here in this COVID world, wildlife trafficking, sort of from the animal health perspective, and then how we can prevent future pandemics. Before I really get into the talk, though, I do think it's worth taking a minute to sit back and breathe and think about where we are today. As I was writing this talk yesterday, we passed the 1 million death mark of COVID-19 in humans. In 10 months, more people have died from this pandemic disease than from malaria, HIV, influenza, and cholera put together. I think that helps put it in perspective of what we are facing right now with this virus. I also appreciate, as I'm sure everyone here today does, of what this means to us on a personal level. We're dealing with family health and wellness, mental and physical health, job security, economic uncertainties, the loss of the very conservation programs that will help prevent pandemics, and frankly, the state of the world and some of the challenges that are facing us. And this pandemic is one example of these challenges. So I think it's fair, before we get into this panel and the discussion, to really sit back and think about the broader context of where we are today in 2020. But what I'd really like to do is just present One Health and move us into wildlife trafficking. And so this approach of One Health is really this collaborative, transdisciplinary approach where we work locally, nationally, globally, with the one goal of optimal health for people, animals, plants, and our shared environment. And I think this panel today is a great example. We have a veterinarian, epidemiologist, anthropologist, conservationist, human virologist. This panel is a One Health panel. As we think about the connectivity of environments, human and non-human animals. This is not a new concept, though. So back in 1856, a human physician who was a pathologist is known to have stated, between animal and human medicine, there is no dividing line, nor should there be. And again, I think COVID is really showing us how true this statement is still today. So what are the greatest threats to One Health? And as Jonathan mentioned, we actually recently published a textbook where we really go into specifics on the challenges we're all facing. But today we're just going to concentrate on the two biggies in my mind, and that's the loss of biodiversity and these emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. And I think you're going to see how the wildlife trade plays into both of these important challenges for us. Many of us on the call today know that we are in the midst of the sixth mass extinction. We are losing species at a rate we have not seen since the loss of dinosaurs. This wonderful report in 2018 from the World Wildlife Fund tells us that we humans have wiped out 60% of animal populations. And you see the usual suspects lined up there of how we are losing these species. And infectious diseases and wildlife trafficking are part of those causes. If you flip forward 2 years to the recent release that just came out a couple of weeks ago, that number has increased to 68%. For those same reasons, climate change, pollution, habitat loss, and for us today to think about infectious diseases and wildlife trafficking. So the wildlife trade is immense, and Dr. Kelly is really going to go into this specifically during her time with us, so I won't belabor it, but this is a huge business. In 2016, it was guesstimated or estimated at about $23 billion. It's up there with arms trade, drug trade, trade in human trafficking, and wildlife trade. It is a big business, this wildlife trade. Again, Dr. Kelly will give us much more information in her time. But the second part of this is the emerging infectious diseases, and we're going to hone in on the human pandemic, but many folks might not be as aware of these emerging infectious diseases that are causing real conservation challenges, right? Even at the level of species extinction. And we list a few here, and I'm sure many of these are familiar to many of you on the call. And two of them, Ebola and rabies, are these zoonotic pathogens. And that's what we're gonna focus on today. So we know in the human species, emerging infectious diseases, which are those diseases that are increasing in our human population or across a broader geographic scale, 75% of these diseases have an animal reservoir. And 70% of those have a wild animal reservoir. So these zoonotic pathogens are of grave concern for human public health, right? And we also know this OIE graphic tells us that in humans, our infectious diseases, 60% have an animal reservoir, but of those emerging diseases, 75% have an animal reservoir. Big numbers to think about. Hopefully many of you are familiar with this book by David Quammen in 2012, Spillover. Excellent book. As Jonathan mentioned, the alarm bells have been going off for decades. I love this book. I hate the cover. A yawning mandrill is not trying to get you sick. What is happening is our changing relationship between human and non-human animals. And in particular, our use of these animals and animal products, often for food, and that's what's getting us into trouble when we think about COVID and other zoonotic epidemics and emerging infectious diseases today. So we know with previous coronaviruses, such as SARS-CoV, the SARS virus in 2003, 2004, that a wet market was involved, civet cats were involved, and bats were the reservoir host. We now are 99.999% sure the same is true of SARS-CoV-2 today. And when we look at wildlife trafficking and these live wet markets where animals are mixed together, we can see how shared pathogens can take place and then spill over into the human population as we consume these animals or trade them and move them around the globe. So I stole this from my husband, Stephen Blake. He uses this in his lectures at SLU. And, you know, I wonder why we are catching diseases from bats and pangolins. When we look at the sheer number of animals that we trade on this planet every day, we can see how these pathogens that are in these animals can easily or can effectively spill over to the human host, which again, Dr. Wang and Dr. Kelly will go into a bit more in their talk. I also would be remiss to not mention spillback. Some folks on the call may be thinking about their dogs and cats and some of the news that we have had SARS-CoV-2 in non-human species after it has spilled back from a human host into a non-human animal. These are very rare events because it is a human adapted virus at this point, but it can happen. And this UC Davis study that came out just in the last month or so did a great job at looking at the different susceptibilities of these species. Some of them are domestic companion animals and some highly endangered species, and that concern from spillback now from human to non-human host. Kind of an ironic situation as we had a non-human animal pathogen go to humans, and now it can spill back into non-human animals. But I'd like to just close before we move on to the other panelists to give the positive side of COVID today. And there's few positives, but one of those is, you know, the fact we're having this webinar. People are starting to wake up to the need to understand public health, human health issues, conservation issues, environmental health, animal, human health, and how it all mixes together, and we're talking about it. And that's the first step to start looking for preventive measures. I just co-wrote with our fellow Maris Bren White a commentary that comes out any day now on showing how One Health really could be the key to preventing the next COVID-19, right, from happening. And two things I thought worth mentioning before we move into Dr. Wang's talk. First, I think we really must understand the cultural, societal, and economic realities that resulted in a COVID-19 world. We also must understand potential critical control points of transmission from the forest to the dinner table and how we can provide those preventive measures along that chain. Lastly, in this report that again, it's open access, it should be out any minute now, Maris and I showed sort of those disciplines that folks can work in from the pathogen to human zoonotic pandemic along those critical control points to help prevent the next pandemic. And hopefully many people on the call are very interested in pursuing these various disciplines. Lastly, I just invite anyone who is interested in One Health, interested in learning what the zoo is doing in this very important movement, both from zoonotic pathogens to conservation of wildlife species, to please feel free to contact me or check out our website on the zoo web pages. And with that, I am passing it back, I think, to either Dr. Wang or Dr. Lasos. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. That's back to me briefly. That was a fascinating talk, a great way to kick off this panel. I do just want to remind all of you watching our panel discussion, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or the chat box if you prefer. And after our three presenters are done, we will have a question and answer period. All right, with that, we'll now go on to our second speaker. David Wang is a professor in both the Department of Molecular Microbiology and the Department of Pathology and Immunology at the Washington University School of Medicine. His laboratory focuses on the identification and characterization of novel viruses, including in the context of outbreaks and emerging infections. Dr. Wang received his PhD from MIT in 1998 and has been at Washington University since 2004. He will speak on emerging zoonotic coronaviruses. Dr. Wang.
Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks, Sharon, for a lovely introduction that will
touches on a lot of the key points for today. What I'm going to do is take a little bit of a deeper dive into this concept of zoonotic viruses leading to human pandemics by focusing specifically on examples from coronaviruses, because for better or for worse, we've had 3 such examples within the past 2 decades. So to begin with, as Sharon pointed out, that the vast majority of emerging diseases are zoonotic, that is, they have animal origin, transmitted to humans from animals. And the cartoon illustration of this is shown here, where on the left side, there are a vast array of animals and insects which harbor a tremendous diversity of viruses. And at some frequency, there is spillover from this animal reservoirs into humans. And then with some even rarer occurrence, some of these viruses are successfully able to efficiently transmit from human to human. And so it requires this series of events for a global pandemic to occur. So again, we're going to illustrate some examples using coronavirus and the history of coronavirology. So here's a timeline that shows the human coronaviruses that we know about. And the first human coronaviruses in black here were discovered in the late 1960s. And these are relatively mild, the common seasonal coronaviruses that have relatively mild disease courses. And for almost 4 decades, these were the only coronaviruses that we knew about. And so it was presumed that coronaviruses were generally relatively innocuous in humans. And the thing that changed that was the emergence in 2002, 2003 of SARS coronavirus 1. And so just to briefly go over that topic, here is a copy of the New York Times from March 15, 2003. This is the day the WHO issued a global alert advising the world that there was this mysterious severe acute respiratory syndrome of unknown etiology emerging from Southeast Asia and that had apparently disseminated to multiple countries around the world. So again, in summary, what happened was that over the course of the next about 8 months, this virus spread to over 25 countries worldwide. There were about 8,000 cases, about 10% of those people died. And this was ultimately demonstrated to be caused by a novel coronavirus, which was named the SARS coronavirus. So the question though is, where did the SARS coronavirus come from? And so the initial epidemiological studies during this outbreak suggested that there was some higher risk associated with people in Guangdong, China, who worked with exotic animals in these live animal wet markets. And so a wet market is something like this, where it's a live animal market where lots of animals, both wild and domesticated, are brought together. They're housed in close proximity and they're sold to people for to either take home to eat or to be cooked on the premises. And this is a huge melting pot and mixing pot for potential virus transmission. So because of the human workers' higher rates of exposure and positivity, animals were tested, and ultimately civet cats and raccoon dogs were found to be positive. And so here's an example of one of those. And as often is the case when something like this has happened, efforts to intervene are implemented, and this involves culling of the animals. And so here's a picture of lots of carcasses of dead civet cats that have been culled in an effort to try to interrupt transmission. Now, unfortunately, the SARS coronavirus had achieved efficient human-to-human transmission, so culling of the animals really had very minimal impact on the course of the outbreak. Moreover, it was found later that as these animals are actually farmed out in the countryside, that testing of the animals in their farms where they were raised showed that none of them were actually positive for SARS coronavirus. So the virus was not endemic to these animals, but rather the civet cats and raccoon dogs must have acquired it in the context of the wet market. And so this led to more extensive and thorough testing of a wide range of animals. And this led to the identification of SARS coronavirus-like viruses present in bats. And so this was a key finding because, first of all, bats turned out to be the ancestral origin of the SARS coronavirus, but also it was discovered over the subsequent decade or so that bats harbor an incredible diversity of not just coronaviruses, but many different viruses from many different families. And so this was previously unrecognized before the SARS-1 outbreak. So in this example then, bats are the reservoir. There's an intermediate animal host of the civet cat. This transmits to humans, and then there's efficient human-to-human transmission, and we had a global outbreak and spread. Okay, so I told you about SARS coronavirus. I told you about the first identification of bat coronaviruses. Because of the increased scrutiny and interest in coronaviruses, 2 additional human viruses were identified right around that time. And these behave very similarly to the original human coronaviruses. And so that is, they seem to be relatively mild in disease severity. They seem to be seasonal. And so they are not similar to SARS-CoV-1 in terms of their disease potential. So all was quiet then until about 2012, when another virus, MERS coronavirus, emerged. And so here's a little cartoon of the Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus. The initial case was found in Saudi Arabia. The vast majority of the cases to date have been found in the Middle East. And there is a key animal reservoir for this is the camel. So almost all the cases have direct transmission from the camels. There are MERS-like viruses in bats, and so bats are thought to be the ancestral reservoirs. And overall, while human-to-human transmission of MERS is not very efficient, there have been some examples of human transmission. And in particular, a noteworthy example is a case of a traveler who went to Korea, who ultimately seeded an outbreak of about 185 cases in South Korea. So there, as well as overall, there's been about a 30 to 35% fatality rate. So we're very, very fortunate that the MERS coronavirus has not been able to adapt efficiently to human spread because it has this very high fatality rate. So in the example of MERS, we have, again, a reservoir of bats. There's spillover or transmission to camels and then spillover into humans. But in this case, the human-to-human transmission seems fairly limited or relatively rare. And so we have not had a global outbreak or pandemic of MERS coronavirus. Okay, so then that takes us to today, to the time of SARS coronavirus 2. And again, just to remind everybody, this needs no reminding for everyone, I'm sure, that December 1st, 2019 was really the earliest case that has been traced back to date in Wuhan, China. That within about a month, in early January, the agent was identified, the whole genome was sequenced, and a virus with fairly high similarity to SARS coronavirus, about 80% identity across the genome, was identified and named SARS-CoV-2 2. It is very, very similar, with greater than 96% identity across its genome, to a coronavirus that's been found in bats. And so this strongly suggests that bats are, once again, the reservoir for this particular virus. What's much less clear right now for SARS-CoV-2 is whether there is, in fact, an intermediate animal host that facilitated the transmission, or whether this was a result of a spillover directly from bats to humans. And we'll just touch about that briefly in the next slide. And of course, in terms of scope and scale, this dwarfs the previous 2 outbreaks. And as of today, again, more than 33 million cases worldwide and more than 1 million deaths. So how does this link potentially to wildlife trade? So one of the leading hypotheses that has been proposed is that pangolins may be somehow involved. And so pangolins are this small animal, kind of armadillo-like, and they're an endangered species. There's a lot of illegal trafficking of this. There's some thought that the scales have medicinal value. And then what has been interesting is that analysis of some of these pangolins has identified coronavirus sequences with fairly high similarity to SARS coronavirus 2. Now, the sequences that have been identified are not as similar as bat ones, suggesting that the bat one is more closely related to SARS-CoV-2, but there are small subregions of the genome where there is higher identity with the pangolin virus. And so this raised the possibility that perhaps there has been some kind of recombination between bats and pangolins. Again, that's just a hypothesis right now, and we don't know what the role of pangolins necessarily is in the transmission of SARS-CoV-2. So here's another example then. We have bats with or without an intermediate host into humans, and then very efficient human-to-human transmission, which has led us to the current situation. Okay, So with that, I just want to wrap up with some take-home points that we as a community, a scientific community, hopefully have learned from 2 decades of emergence of new coronaviruses. And so one is that bats are a reservoir for many, many coronaviruses and many other viruses. That virus spillover from wildlife like bats, but not limited to bats, into other animals as well as humans can occur. And that it is on occasion that this leads to human disease and efficient human-to-human transmission. And once again, we've had 3 emergence events of novel coronaviruses in the past 17 years. And so it would behoove us to think about how many more will come and what will we have learned from these past and ongoing events in order to be more prepared for the next one to come. And our theme from the session today is that the bat, animal, and human interface is absolutely critical to the emergence of new viruses. And so with that, I'll turn it over back to Jonathan. Jonathan, I think you're muted, so you've been talking on the mute.
Well, how unprofessional of me. Let me start over again. Our next speaker is Dr. Lisa Kelly, who is the Executive Director of the St. Louis Zoo's Wild Care Institute, one of the major participants in the Living Earth Collaborative biodiversity community. After attending Washington University as an undergraduate, Dr. Kelly worked as a keeper at the primate house at the St. Louis Zoo before returning to WashU to conduct doctoral research, studying with the fabled primatologist Bob Sussman, studying lemurs in Madagascar, work for which she received her PhD. She then returned back to the St. Louis Zoo, where she has been involved with the Wild Care Institute for the last 4 years. Lisa, Dr. Kelly is going to tell us more about wildlife trafficking, and her presentation is entitled, "What Zoos Are Doing to Help Protect Species from the Threat of Wildlife Trafficking." Dr. Kelly.
Thank you, Dr. Lossos. And thank you for giving this opportunity to be able to talk about what zoos are doing. And for this talk, I'm also going to be wearing my Association of Zoos and Aquarium Wildlife Conservation Committee Saving Animals from Extinction Coordinator hat, because the point of my talk is that this is much bigger than a single institution. This involves wildlife trafficking, involves multiple stakeholders from multiple disciplines, as this panel is illustrating. So as Dr. Lossos mentioned, my background's a little different than the other 2 panelists in that I do not have a medical degree. My dissertation research was done in the far south of Madagascar, studying ring-tailed lemurs, because at that time in 2007 and 2008, this species had only been studied in well-protected reserves. And we were very curious, my advisor and I, as to how they fared in environments that interacted with and coexisted with humans. And I should emphasize that Madagascar is one of the poorest non-warring countries on this earth. And where I studied was one of the poorest areas in Madagascar. So when I was down there, so look at the middle slide, one of them is my husband, the other one is Tuvut's, who was the chief of the village where I studied. And they really, if they had wanted to, they could have wiped out the whole ringtail lemur troop in an afternoon, but they coexisted with them, even in the fact that the ringtail lemurs slept in the cultivated prickly pear hedges that they depend upon and fed upon their crops. But also present there were the critically endangered radiated tortoises. And I knew they were critically endangered, but it seemed so hard to believe because we would trip on them all the time. They were so prevalent. If you look at the picture on the far right, the radiated tortoises would commonly go up to the lemurs when they were sunning, get just close enough. And if I was to show you the next photo, the lemur takes off in fear. I can't get in the head of a radiated tortoise, but I'm thinking they had great fun with that. But Tuvut's would tell me that the reason why they were so prevalent is they left them alone, and that killing a radiated tortoise would be like killing a child. And who would want to do that? But he did mention that tribes further northwest would come through, and they would take them and they would sometimes consume them for soups. So back then, over 10 years ago, I knew they were critically endangered. I knew they were taken and consumed, but I still was shocked when over 10 years later, in the news, 2019, the reports of the 17,000 radiated tortoises that were confiscated from two different sites. And you see here some of the press about it. National Geographic Turtle Survival Alliance, a program that the zoo helped support, took on a brunt of that. You see the picture on the far right, that's one of Dr. Deem's team. Maris Brown-White went down there with someone from Animal Health, Jane Merkel, to do health assessments in the hopes that they would be able to release some of these animals. And I think about 1,000 have been released, which seems like a lot, but when you think about this sheer number of 17,000, something to emphasize is that even when these animals are confiscated, very few of them are able to return to the wild ultimately. So I just want to briefly give a little background about the St. Louis Zoo Wild Care Institute, because it's relevant to how the zoos are set up to combat wildlife trafficking. So as you see here, the Wild Care Institute has a global presence, 17 centers and 11 programs. A program is pretty self-explanatory. It's focused, involves a couple projects, 1 or 2 partners. Centers are much larger and in breadth. They include numerous partners oftentimes. They all have these 3 main pillars: wildlife management and recovery, which is so protection of the wildlife and the habitats that fall under that umbrella; conservation science, that includes conservation research with better applied conservation action; and then the human dimension, which can take multiple forms, whether it be training the community to have that coexist with the wildlife to become those rangers or scouts for the wildlife that they coexist with, or in even formal dimensions such as through fellowships and PhD programs. So WildCare is well set up to address the major threats that impact biodiversity, but wildlife trafficking, it's so immense that we've been struggling the last few years of how do we best combat this. And one of the more organized ways has been really through the turtles and tortoises, what we call the colonian work. As you see our picture on the right, Lauren Augustine, our curator for herpetology, is the coordinator for the Asian Turtle Conservation Program. She provides support for them with, because you can imagine the immense issue of confiscated turtles in Vietnam and what's needed for support to care for those that are confiscated, as well as awareness campaigns. I mentioned Dr. Maris Brown-White's work in Madagascar. And then Dr. Deem's team also has a box turtle project. And while that focus has been on ranging behavior between urban and rural environments, some of the things they suspect, and maybe Dr. Deem could elaborate this in the Q&A section, is that maybe some of the turtles were there because they were former pets that people had dropped off, or even potentially if a turtle disappears, is it possibly taken as a pet. Other ways in which we've historically addressed wildlife trafficking has primarily been through anti-poaching, specifically in northern Kenya, through the Northern Rangelands Trust being one of the partners under the Center for Conservation in the Horn of Africa. And we've supported programs with the species that you probably, when you've thought of wildlife trafficking, these are the ones you're most apt to think about. And you should. In fact, Ian Craig, who is the founder of Northern Rangelands Trust, initially created, the way he got started in wildlife conservation and advocacy is that there was only 500 rhinos left in Kenya in the 1980s. And so his family's cattle ranch, they transformed that into a conservancy to protect rhinos, and it's obviously grown much more so since then. You know about the African elephants and the great decline of the elephants. The Great Elephant Census by the Paul Allen Project found that 30% decline, in African elephants between 2007 and 2014, and in large part because of poaching. But what I want to emphasize here, we're talking about biodiversity. Wildlife trafficking doesn't just impact a single species. And a really good example of that, again, in 2019, a major story of vultures, 537 vultures poisoned because poachers who had put poison over the carcasses of elephants to cover their tracks, it ended up killing the vultures. And that was done intentionally because vultures are often sort of the sentinels for poaching sites that anti-poaching rangers can use. So this was a way to cover their tracks. But poisoning, even incidental poisonings of vultures, has become one of the primary threats for that species. And unfortunately, African vultures in their own right are directly impacted by trafficking for their parts of their body. So Dr. Deem already showed the 5 major threats that of which species are the threats to biodiversity. But what I hope you're starting to see is a clear pattern here is that they are not separate threats. They are all interconnected, excuse me. So for example, the fact wildlife trafficking and non-native pathogens here is in large part to do with why we're here today, and habitat loss, of course, being interconnected with climate change. So what has this pandemic taught us? And I'm starting to feel like when I gave these examples, starting to realize that maybe 2019 should have been the foreshadowing to what was to come in 2020. Through the Association of Zoos and Aquarium group, we have the Wildlife Trafficking Alliance, which has joined forces with the zoos and aquariums because of the tremendous ability for zoos to be able to engage the public with some of the things we do best with their millions of visitors every year. And the Wildlife Trafficking Alliance had done a great job with reducing consumer demand and mobilizing companies to assume best practices. For example, they work with eBay and eBay's been very receptive to ensure that illicit trafficking behaviors don't occur on their platform. But what the pandemic was eye-opening to them was that what was missing was that public health component, the One Health approach. And I'm very proud to say that the director of the Alliance reached out and asked to be connected with Dr. Deem and her team, as well as her colleagues from WCS. And Dr. Deem has been one of the primary consultants to implement this One Health component into the Wildlife Trafficking Alliance work that they do. Now, programmatically, which is sort of more my specialty, as the coordinator of SAFE programs, so a SAFE program, I've described what a center is. A SAFE program amplify that. It's required that multiple institutions, at least 3, be involved through a SAFE program. Some of them, like North American Songbirds, have as many as 30 zoos working together. I was surprised when I was putting the data together for this talk that a full 14 of the 28 SAFE programs that exist list wildlife trafficking as one of the major threats for that species or group of species. And some of those would be obvious, like the examples we've discussed today. Some may be a little less obvious. For example, with the hornbills. Hornbills are a threat for trafficking as pets, but there's a species called the helmeted hornbill that their casque is called red ivory. It's not ivory, but it's considered even more valuable than ivory tusk. So they are imminently in danger of extinction because of that. Asian elephants, think of the males being poached for their tusks. Well, the entire herd is at risk because of the skins are being trafficked. Cheetahs in Tanzania, the cheetah population is being decimated because of the live pet trade wanting to have cheetahs as pets, for example. So one thing I really want to emphasize and get across to everyone, because it was sort of my wake-up call this last year, is that when we think of wildlife trafficking, we often think of it occurring to wildlife elsewhere, right, outside of the US, and the issues being with import or coming in and happening elsewhere. But our own species in North America are at risk through wildlife trafficking, and probably the best recognized examples are the American turtles. There was a Turtle Survival Alliance conference that's recorded, and there's a whole section on wildlife trafficking, and an excellent presentation by someone who was on the front lines working as long as 2007, seeing just how organized the trafficking is, and with turtles, and things they do, like using snapping turtles and putting some of them in with the other turtles because no one's going to mess with a snapping turtle, and just what big business it is. And the St. Louis Zoo, through collaborations with the Laura and Augustine, the herpetology department, ICM, and Wildcare, will be working with this SAFE program to really address this at a programmatic level. And then I want to emphasize, so songbirds. You may have heard that Asian songbirds are at risk of extinction because of the wildlife trafficking and through songbird sort of competitions. But the danger of this occurring with North American songbirds is just being touched upon. We know North American songbirds, if you see the news media, you know they're in rapid decline, and because of habitat loss, because of bird strikes, window strikes, because of outdoor cats. Well, unfortunately, trafficking of may also have to be added to that list, as it looks like there is some illicit trafficking in North American songbirds as they're migrating across the US. So I just want to close by saying, for all of you out there, that we need your help. There are 4 real ways that I was thinking of what you could address wildlife trafficking. One being through advocacy, of which zoos are collectively doing through our government affairs program. Talked about education, the One Health concept in public health that Dr. Deem's team and Dr. Wang's teams are doing, but also this programmatic species-based approach. I think about who may be out here listening to a Living Earth Collaborative seminar, and I know it's a very diverse group, but I'm guessing there's a lot of students out there. And when is a better time to be able to, literally it's your job to delve deep into a topic and really research what's going on. So if you're out there and you're interested, I would welcome you approaching us and see the best ways that we could get this as a part of your studies and really get you invested in this topic. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Lesses.
Well, thank you, Lisa. That was a fascinating talk, a fascinating set of talks, I must say. We've got about 15 minutes to answer some questions, and we've got some really great questions here in the Q&A box and the chat box. And so I'm going to go to a couple of them. I'll start by saying there was a lot of interest in bats. And so let's start with some bat questions. Deborah Merskin asks, how do we educate the public to prevent demonization of bats as very important animals in the world so they are preserved? Yet at the same time, this is me talking, Dr. Wang has identified the bat-human interface as a key means of transmitting new diseases to humans. So the question I would ask is, how do we work to prevent transmission from bats to human while at the same time conserving bats? Or as one other questioner asked, maybe we should just go out and kill all the bats. I presume that's not the answer. Maybe Dr. Deem, would you like to start with that one?
I would love to start with this one. And Deborah, this is a great question and something that I think is so important and goes to that education advocacy piece. We know that bats do harbor undiscovered pathogens, and it has to do with their physiology and immune systems. What totally agree with you, we cannot demonize the bats. And I think one of the points you're making is their role in ecosystem services, right? So if we look at bats and what they do for us from pollination to pest control, we can see that bats actually may be preventing us from those other zoonotic diseases like Zika virus and West Nile virus. So bats are part of the ecosystem. I think the real question, and why I kind of said the forest to dinner table, those critical linkages, is bats have lived with these potential pathogens, these microbes, for millions of years. It's this increased interface, right? It's all about that interface. How are bats now being set next to a pangolin or being in a wet market and then interacting with other species so things can spill over? And one of the questions I saw by a few people, you know, you're giving us a lot of problems. What are the solutions? Well, one of those is to really think about that interface. We can find every virus there is in a bat, but that won't really help us if we don't look at the mechanisms, the societal, cultural, public health mechanisms to stop that interface.
Would either of the other panelists have anything to add on these points?
I mean, I think that Sharon touched on all the key points there, that the solution is not to eradicate any species, of course, because that's going to create even more problems unanticipated than we, started with. And again, it is, in my mind, it's about, and this is well established, National Academy of Sciences have many studies about the factors leading to increased emergence in the last 2 decades. And it's this really increased interaction due to a lot of human behaviors, deforestation, expanding to the edge of the forest, shrinking the natural habitat, destroying the natural food source, so then they have to migrate to other areas where there's maybe agricultural crops and you have increased exposures. So I think that, I mean, this is perhaps a bit naive, but sort of increased respect for all life and in this way would minimize the contact, and then that reduces the transmission risks. So that's what I would add.
So Dave, a follow-up on bats from several of the questioners, which was, how does the disease actually get transmitted from bats to animals? You said, I think, right, with SARS, that the 2003 one, that it was in the wet market itself. But how does that happen? And is it always in the wet market or sometimes out in nature? Right. So it's pretty clear evidence from SARS-CoV-1 episode that the civet cats acquired it in the wet market. There was no observation or experimental transmission from bats. It's inferred from the idea that there are SARS, near identical viruses to SARS in bats, and then somehow it got into the civet cats in the wet markets because when they were farmed, they were negative for SARS. So it could be that there was yet another intermediate animal that a bat got into from the bat, it got into something else, then into the civet cat. So we don't know that it's direct. But the presumed model is that the bats would shed the virus in saliva or fecal material or urine. There's all these cages stacked up. The animals on the bottom get exposed. It's a respiratory virus. So I saw someone asked about ingestion and consumption. So this is probably respiratory droplet or aerosol transmission in this close proximity that seeds the infection. So I would say that that's probably for these coronaviruses. They're mostly respiratory type. It's not to say there couldn't be fecal orally transmitted viruses from the bats into animals that then get into humans as well. So I think that those are the most likely series of events. We don't have explicit evidence for that exact transmission chain. A follow-up question to some extent. Dave, you spoke about the three major, I believe the major emerging infectious diseases that have affected humans are all coronaviruses. Yet my understanding is that there are many other emerging diseases that are not. I'm no expert on this, but Ebola, a Nile, whatchamacallit, and so on. Are coronaviruses particularly bad, or is it just, is there anything special or different about how they will affect us as opposed to the many other types of diseases we need to worry about?
Right, so I didn't want to get, I hope I didn't mistakenly give the impression that these were the three major pandemics of the last events of the last 17 years, because there's been a lot of events. There was H1N1 influenza in 2009. There was Zika in 2015, 2016-ish. There was West Nile emergence in 1999. So there is, in fact, And you can go back HIV in 1980s, right? So there are many, many viruses with potential to emerge. And I focus today on coronaviruses because of the context of COVID and where we are right now. And so it's a little bit hard to generalize. Flaviviruses have a lot of potential for disease, so that's what Zika and West Nile are. The coronaviruses clearly do. I think one issue here is that the coronaviruses are respiratory transmitted, and so that makes them more prone to pandemics where there's lots of transmission from human to human. The Zika, I think there's some evidence of sexual transmission, but primarily it's vector transmitted. So if you eliminate exposure to bites from mosquitoes, then you can eliminate transmission to a large degree. And that's easier to do than obviously quarantining, the whole world's population.
Thank you. A question, I think, for Lisa, and Andrew White says, bushmeat and wet markets don't happen in a vacuum. What are some systemic alternatives that could be provided to people in Africa, Asia, and other decolonized countries who need to eat? Or I think more generally, a lot of these things are going on because people need to have a living. How do we give them alternatives?
So, and I'll probably ask for the other panelists to add in after I'll take a stab at it, let's put it that way. So one thing, at least in the zoo community, we're being very careful about is, while there is the issue of wildlife trade for human consumption, to not have it impact local communities. I don't think that is where this issue is occurring. It's in fact there, I don't want to plug another group talks, but through the Turtle Survival Alliance, the follow-up talk was about Chinese culture. And one of the things she emphasized is that those who are consuming these animals in this unsustainable way is actually the elite and a very small percent. And it's the subsistence hunters, that is not, I do not believe, contributing to the issues at hand with the wet markets. I don't know if Sharon or Dave want to add to that, but I would say we're actually being very careful not to have anything negatively impact subsistence hunters, and that doesn't seem to be where that issue lies.
I could chime in real quickly. I think agree completely. I think when we look at what is happening, and there's 7.8 billion of us, everyone on this call today will probably eat something today. So as some of the questions have been, how do we feed 7.8 people without killing the planet, which I think is a good One Health question, right? And I think, from a numbers game, when bushmeat or eating wildlife was in a localized level for a village or in small bite-sized kind of places, it's a totally different ballgame than the international movement of animals today and what has become this wildlife trade on a global scale. But I think, some of the questions that have been listed here, they're fantastic questions. Yeah, how do we humanely feed humans and offer public health without destroying the very resources that have made us able to be 7.8 billion people? That might be the $1 trillion question today, right?
Well, I have you here, Sharon. I've got another one directly for you.
Good.
And that is, what do you think it will take for the world's leaders to embrace One Health practices and realize that by following these practices, we will see improvements in all other aspects of our lives?
Excellent. And that is from Jennifer, who is a head veterinarian here in the US. So thank you, Jennifer. I think there's a few things. And again, One Health is starting to pick up. Even in January of this year, the Congress, we have a resolution that it was the One Health Awareness Month, right? And that was right before all the wildfires and COVID hit. So One Health has hit to the highest levels of government, even in this wacky year of 2020. So I think it is starting to catch on. I think the fact that we have panels like this with different expertise coming together to think about these major public health and conservation challenges. That is One Health. We're seeing it across universities and all levels of schooling from K through 12 up through graduate programs where the One Health model and approach is coming to be. And we're seeing at a more international government level where we have the World Health Organization and OIE and FAO all working together in this tripartite One Health program. So I think, to your question, we got a long way to go. Again, I think if there's one positive COVID has given us, it's opened the eyes of why we do need this One Health approach, and some movement is taking place.
So I've got, one quick question, just back to bats, because this was a question I had myself, but the question was, are these wet markets, are people selling bats in them, or are bats swooping in somehow? So the bats are actually being sold to be eaten or for medicinal purposes or so on.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Lauren Salzman asked an interesting question. We talk about these issues as if they're things happening around the world that then impact us here in the United States. But in fact, are there viruses transmitted via animals to people here in the US, or do we have issues here at home that we need to deal with as well?
Do you want me to take that? Well, I can start. I'll start it. So yeah, and I think that's a really good point, that we can't say this is, as was brought up by a previous question, this is not just a problem over there. Of course, we have animal pathogens that are being transmitted right here in the US. The good thing is, and we'll start with food animals, let's say, we do have biosecurity and veterinary controls for that very reason. So things like tuberculosis or brucellosis or some of those zoonotic diseases we know are related to food animal and humans are controlled. So I think, we are in a better place than maybe some other countries because of the very hard work for these biosecurity controls. But we do increasingly have a number of pathogens like chronic wasting disease that may be in our deer population, that may be able to impact humans. So we're increasingly seeing some of these pathogens that may be in our wildlife populations related to our companion or food animals that may impact humans. So so the short answer is, it's not just a problem over there. It's not just wet markets.
And I would add quickly, so yes, we often think about, oh, SARS came from, Southeast China and so on. But right in Missouri, which I assume most of the people who are attending, although obviously people could be anywhere, in Missouri, in the past 5 years, there have been 2 novel emerging viruses discovered, one in Missouri, one in Kansas, technically. One is called Heartland virus, which is a tick-transmitted virus. It's been a couple dozen cases with a handful of fatalities. And then another tick-borne virus, Bourbon virus, which has had a couple of fatalities and about 10 or 15-ish cases so far. And without a doubt, there's many, many more cases of this, just no one ever knew to look for it. But now that the virus has been identified and diagnostic tests can be applied, we're starting to understand what the true disease burden of this virus is. Again, it seems to require a tick vector, and so that's going to limit its pandemic potential if there is not human-to-human transmission. But nonetheless, these are new emerging viruses with potentially fatal consequences, and these are happening right here in the Midwest of the United States.
That's fascinating. I did not know that, and a little bit scary too. Well, unfortunately, it's now 5 o'clock here in Central Standard Time and or Daylight Time. And so our time is up, which is unfortunate because we've got a lot of other great questions and comments that we did not get a chance to get to. So I apologize to all of you who asked those questions. And I'd like to thank our panelists for doing an excellent job with their presentations and their discussion. So thank you so much. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.